Hearing the voice of God. How do you do that? This year we've decided to go through the Bible. We've decided to kind of go through and look at some of the major books that kind of give us God's story. And I hope through all of this we will hear the voice of God. Last month we began our journey in the book of Genesis. And while in the book of Genesis we found there that God had a lot of power, did a lot of things, interacted with mankind. From the very beginning in Genesis chapter 3, there was a promise that a Redeemer would come, one who would crush the head of Satan. In chapter 12, we found that there was a promise to Abraham that God was going to make a great nation, give him a land, and that a blessing, a promise of Christ would come and bless the whole world. And in the book of Joseph last week, as we looked at the integrity and what that means to our lives. And we left us at the end of Genesis and everything was going great. The children of Israel, only at that time 70 people had moved down to Egypt. They were well taken care of, had everything they needed. Joseph had died at the end of the chapter, and it appears that all is well in Egypt. And then you turn a page and you get to the book of Exodus, and all of a sudden things begin to change. But this is also part of God's plan, because we find that in Genesis chapter 15, God said this to Abraham. He said, "Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own. And they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve. I will punish the nation they serve as slaves. And afterward they will come out with great possessions." God gives us a preview. He gives us a foresight of what it's going to be. And we go into the book of Exodus, and all of a sudden, the whole situation has changed. Now, I want to kind of to share with you the story of Exodus 1 through 4, because we need to know that to get to where we're going to end up today. Because in Exodus chapter 1, we find that transition. We find the explanation of how in the world did they go from everything's great in Egypt to the point where it was a mess, at least for the children of Israel. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 11, we find out what happened. It says, "In time, Joseph and all of the brothers died, ending the entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Eventually, a new king came along in power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done." That's the beginning of the end. "And he said to his people, 'Look, the people of Israel are now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape the country.' So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves." Now the new king, the one that came into power, was frightened by the sheer number of the children of Israel. So he had a plan. If we have less of them, they'll have less power. So what he does, he tells the midwives, when a Hebrew woman is having a baby and it's a son, kill that son. The midwives, they couldn't do that. And they didn't do that. Well, then Pharaoh said, "All right, here's the law. If you have a son, that son must be killed." And that was the law of the land. But there was one mother who had a little boy, and he was hidden from all the authorities. This mother took care of him, coddled him, fed him until he was about 3 months old, and then decided, I guess, man, I can't hide him any longer. Can you imagine keeping a 3-month-old baby quiet all the time so they couldn't be heard? It would be an impossible task. So mom got this idea. I'm going to put him in a basket. I'm going to set him in the river there. And there was a bunch of reeds or cattails or reeds down there. And the basket floated down, got stuck, and Pharaoh's daughter's out wandering by the river that day. And she looks down, sees a basket, and runs over to the basket and opens the lid. And there's this cute little baby boy. She picks up that basket and goes home and says, "Look what I found, Dad. Can I keep him?" And Dad said, "Okay." And then Moses' sister was watching this whole thing. She runs up to the daughter and says, "Hey, can I go get a Hebrew woman to take care of this little baby for you?" And she said, "Sure, go for it." So she ran off, and found Moses' mom. And Moses' mom got to come and take care of the baby, didn't have to buy diapers or food. Now, what a deal was that? And she got to take care of her son. Well, Moses grew up. We don't hear anything about him as a child, but he grew up there in the king's household in Egypt. But when he was a young man, he knew who he was. I think it was his mom said, "You're one of us. You're one of the Hebrews." He was out watching one of the Hebrew slave, or one of the Egyptian slave drivers mistreating a Hebrew slave. In fact, mistreated him to the point that he killed him. And this really bothered Moses, and he went over and he killed that Egyptian, thinking that no one saw. But the next day he goes back out to where the slaves were, and two of the slaves get in a fight, and he goes up and tries to settle that fight. One of them looks at Moses and said, "Oh, you going to kill me like you did the guy yesterday?" And Moses said, "Uh-oh, I am in trouble here. Word's going to get out." So Moses hightails it out of town. He leaves, and he goes into the wilderness. And he goes up to this well one day, and there are these 7 daughters coming out to draw water, and they were being attacked by some robbers there. And Moses comes to the rescue. He rescues the girls, and then they invite him home to come and meet their family. And that's what happened. And Moses was accepted into the family there. They took care of him, and eventually he married one of those girls, Zipporah, and settled his life down, became a shepherd in the wilderness for 40 years. And everything was hunky-dory. Everything was fine. Everything was going just like he wanted it to go. Until one day God turned His word upside down, and in Exodus chapter 3, this is what happened. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock far into the wilderness and came to the Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of the bush, and Moses stared in amazement. And though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. "This is amazing," Moses said to himself. "Why isn't the bush burning up? I must go see it." And that's exactly what Moses did. And you know that story is the story of the burning bush. And he went over to that bush, and he wasn't expecting it, but all of a sudden a voice came out of that bush and said, "Moses, have I got a deal for you? Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back to Egypt. I've heard the crying out of my people, and I want you to lead those people out of that bondage and into freedom." And you would have thought, Moses said, "Oh man, this is the chance I've been waiting for. I've been wanting to go back to Egypt. It was a lot nicer than this wilderness is." But instead he says, "God, you got the wrong guy. I kind of like being shepherd. And he says, "Who am I?" In chapter 3, verse 11, he says, "But Moses protested to God, 'Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people out of Egypt?' And God said, 'I will be with you.'" And you're thinking now, when God speaks to you through a burning bush and it's not being burned up, and He tells you what you're going to do, and you complain, and God says, "I've got this," you would say, "Okay, God, we'll do what you want." Not Moses. He said, "But who am I?" And in chapter 4, the protesting continues, and he says, "But Moses protested again. 'What if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you?'" Now what he's talking about there is, all right, you want me to face Pharaoh, that's not going to go well. But what happens if I go to my own people, the Hebrews, and they don't even believe? He was worried about that. So in verse 2 it says, "And the Lord asked him, 'What is that in your hand?' 'A shepherd's staff,' Moses replied." That question, what's in your hand, is the key point I want to focus in on today. What's in your hand? Moses answers the question and says, "Well, it's the shepherd's staff." How would you answer it? I love the question because it is God taking Moses where he is and working with what he has. He didn't say to Moses, "All right, Moses, I got a job for you, and here's kind of what you need to do. First, I kind of want you to go to 4 years of military training. That's going to come in handy down the road. Just trust me in this. And then, Moses, you've been out in this wilderness for a long time, haven't been interacting with too many people. I want you to take a course on how to win friends and influence people. Once you pass that, you need to go sign up for the TV show Survivor so that you know how to survive all these people and the wilderness. No, God didn't say any of that to him. He didn't say, you've got to do this, this, and this. He just simply said, Moses, what's in your hand? Moses, what do you have? And he said, I got this stick. I got this shepherd's staff. And God took that and said, Moses, you're worried about what the people are going to think. You're worried that they're not going to believe you. Throw down that stick. And he throws down the stick and it turns into a snake. And Moses does what? He runs. That's what most of you would have done, right? See, I figure Moses has been in the wilderness 40 years and he knows a bad snake from a good snake. Now, I don't think it was any cute little garter snake, all right? I think it was probably a poisonous, venomous snake. He looked at that snake and he took off the other way, and God says, wait a minute, come back here. You need to pick that snake up and then pick him up by the tail. Now, how smart is that? That's not smart. If any of you ever get the urge to go pick up snakes, don't pick them up by the tail, all right? Because especially a poisonous snake, you pick that snake up by the tail, it's going to zip around and it's going to bite you. But God said, pick that snake up, and Moses did, and it turned back to a stick. Moses still wasn't convinced, and God said, all right, put your hand in your cloak and pull it back out. And he pulls it out, it's covered with leprosy, the most dreaded disease in the Bible. I'm sure that shocked Moses. And then God says, put it back in there, and he puts it back in, pulls it back out, and it's cured. And he said, all right, Moses, you're worried, you're doubting. When you go to Egypt and they don't believe you and they want to know who you are, just do those two things and they'll be convinced. And you would think at that point Moses would say, okay, but what does he do? But God, you've got the wrong guy. I can't even talk. Well, so that's no big deal. I got Aaron, your brother. He'll take care of you. He'll talk for you. And finally, at the end of the excuse list, he'd gone through the whole thing, checked them all off. There was nowhere else to go. Verse 17, God says to him, but take this staff in your hand so that you can perform miraculous signs with it. And in verse 20, chapter 4, it says, so Moses took his wife and his sons and put them on a donkey and started back to Egypt and took the staff of God in his hands. What started out as the hands of a murderer in Exodus 1 are transformed into the hands of a man of God in chapter 4. What starts out as a stick in the wilderness that Moses picked up and turned into a staff now becomes the staff of God. And it's with that stick, it's with that staff that Moses goes back to Egypt. And next week we're going to look at the 10 plagues, so I won't spoil that. You'll have to come back and find out what those are all about. But he gets to the edge of the Red Sea, he holds that staff up, and the Red Sea parts, they go across, they get in the wilderness, things are going fine until they get thirsty, and all of a sudden you got 1 million people and no water. Moses takes that stick and he strikes the rock, and 1 million people have enough water. And then he takes that rod and he takes that staff and he leads the people for 40 years in the wilderness. Moses, what you got in your hand? Oh, I got this staff. Great. That's what I need, God said. Here's what you're going to do. Now, I want us to take that story and I want to take that question that God asked, what's in your hand? And get you thinking about some things. Every week, I need to answer the question before I preach, what is it I want to happen as a result of this? And here's the deal. If you don't remember anything else, here's what I want to happen. I want all of us to be challenged to take one more step in our faith. To do one more thing that maybe we've never done before. and dare to take the next step in our journey with God. You see, as Christians today, we've been given a daunting task. He has said, be light of the world in a world that seems to be getting darker and darker and darker. He has told us to be salt of the earth in a world that is losing any preservative value. He's called us to go into all the world and preach the gospel, and the world's not getting any smaller in population. You see, the mission that all of us signed up for is a major, major mission, and it's a daunting task. And the question that we must answer is this: what do you have in your hand that God wants to use to help fulfill His mission? I think of Jesus as He went about His ministry. There were times when He somewhat challenged people with the same type of question. One day He'd been teaching all day. The disciples come up to Him and said, Jesus, it is late. These people are hungry. Send them in town. McDonald's is still open. They'll find something there. And Jesus says, no. What do you got? What do you got? Well, we don't have anything, but there's this little boy here who has 2 fish, 5 loaves of bread. Jesus bring it, takes it out of His hand, and blesses it and feeds 5,000 people. One of the few miracles that's repeated in all 4 of the Gospels that was so amazing. One day He's walking alongside the Sea of Galilee, and there's some guys sitting there working with their hands. What are they doing? They're mending their nets, getting them all fixed up so they can go out the next day and catch more fish. And Jesus looked at them and said, hey guys, what are you doing? Well, we're mending our nets. He said, leave your nets, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And they left and they followed Jesus. What's in your hand? How do you know? That's a fair question. Let me give you 3 things to think about. One is this. Sometimes you find out what's in your hand by living in the desert. What I mean by that? Well, Moses had been in the wilderness or in the desert for 40 years. He was running away from Egypt. He was hiding. He was trying to get away from what he had done. But while he was in that desert, I'm sure that he learned some things that would help him down the road. He found a stick along the way. He said, this will make a nice staff. I'll just hang on to this for a while. And he found that stick and he used it as a staff to guide those sheep. That desert period was used in Moses' life to prepare him for what God had on down the road. Have you ever heard somebody say, I feel like I'm in a desert? Not literally, but figuratively. You may be running from something in your life. You may be hiding from something. You may just be trying to figure out life. Spiritually, you feel like you've hit flat line. You pray and you don't think it goes beyond the ceiling. You have lost your joy. You've lost your enthusiasm, your drive, and you're just in kind of a funk. That's what I mean by a desert. It was in the desert time that Moses may have learned some things that prepared him for the mission. And I want to challenge you, sometimes you find out what's in your hand when you're in the middle of that desert. And sometimes God can use those desert periods in our life to help prepare us for what's coming down the road. There may be a time in your life where you know how to help that person who's lost a loved one because you've been there in that desert before. It may mean helping someone work through some problem they have in their life because you've been in that desert before. You've been there in that problem and you've understood what it was like and what it would take to get out of that desert. It may be giving advice of what not to do because you messed up and made some bad decisions along the way and you know that that's not the road to go down. It may be just the opposite. It may be you giving some advice and saying, look, this is what I did and it worked for me. You connect the dots, you fill in the blanks, but There may be times in your life that are a desert, and you may not understand why you're in that desert, but Moses was in the desert, and he picked up the stick, and God came along and said, Moses, what's that in your hand? I want you to take what you've got, and I want you to go and do what I need done. The second thing I think we can think about is this. Sometimes you find out what's in your hand by having a stick day rather than a snake day. You're thinking, what in the world is he talking about? Well, Moses had a snake day. His snake day was the day of the miracle, all right? His snake day was when God came to him and said, Moses, throw down that stick, and it turns to a snake, and he picks it up, and it turns back to the snake. A stick is not something that was normal. That staff had just been there. It had just been a stick. And yet God did something miraculous with it. That's a snake day. To see the miraculous works of God. Well, here's my point. If we're always looking for the spectacular, and we only do something when the snake day happens, we're going to miss an awful lot. We may even get frustrated. We may even get discouraged. Because that stick was a stick a lot more than it was a snake. Most of that time, that stick just did what it was supposed to do. It was used to prod. It was used to guide. It was stood in the corner and just stood there as a stick. But it served its purpose faithfully day after day. Here's my point. Sometimes we just need to do the right thing. Day after day after day. We're going to have a lot more stick days than we are snake days. And it's sometimes we grow the most. We move forward the most. When there are no fireworks that are going off, there's no parades given in your honor, no TV crews parking outside your place to interview you because all the marvelous things you've done. Most of our days are just stick days. And those are the days that God says, what's in your hand that you can use for me? One final thought. Sometimes you find out what's in your hand when you dare to go out of your comfort zone. When you dare to do something out of your comfort zone. You know, I think Moses kind of enjoyed his life as a shepherd. But after God had shot down all of his excuses, Moses still, even though reluctantly, went and did something that he at first did not want to do. He dared to go beyond. He dared to take that next step. He dared to confront Pharaoh. He dared to try to lead a bunch of cranky slaves that had been in bondage for a long time. He dared to become a tour guide through the wilderness. Do you think he was scared? I would have been. Do you think he ever got frustrated dealing with 1 million people? Probably. Do you ever think there were days he just wanted to run to the hills and find some sheep and just hang out there for a while? I bet there were. But he still did what God called him to do up to the very end. What is it that God has placed in your hands that you've been reluctant to do, that you've been reluctant to respond to? There are all kinds of things, and here it is again. I challenge you to say, well, God, what is it you've placed in my hand? What is out there? Maybe there's something that I could do, even though I'm scared and I'm not sure. It may be frustrating at times. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but there always seems to be ministry opportunities here at church. There's always things that need to be done and things that need to be fulfilled. Justin's going to come up at the end and say, we need some help with Vacation Bible School come up in March. Why? Because you need teachers and you need workers for that. We need help in nursery. We're blessed by having young children in the nursery. And we want to reach families and bring them in. Your ministry may be helping serve in the nursery so that a new mom or dad can come and sit and worship. Help in teaching, all those things. Maybe you would like to be a helper at the elementary schools. They're looking for people that will come in and spend some time just with the kids. Robert does that once a week. Helps over at the elementary school. Lead a ministry. Talk to someone about Christ. What is it that's going to make you take the next step to grow just a little bit more in your faith? So what's in your hand that God wants to take and do something special with? There was a story in the newspaper about a Thanksgiving Day event in one of the local schools. The story told about a teacher who, with her class of first graders, challenged him to draw a picture of something they were thankful for. She thought it would be good for those children to think about that, even though she knew most of them were very poor and probably didn't have a lot of material things to be thankful for and to draw on that page. But she wanted to do that anyway, and she figured that they would draw turkeys or food, on the table, things like that, the normal, traditional Thanksgiving Day stuff. But the teacher is taken back by a little picture by a little boy by the name of Douglas. And as she was going through the picture, she'd hold him up and said, "Oh, who drew this?" And some kid would, "Oh, that's mine. That's a picture of the turkey we're going to have." And then she held up the picture of Douglas, and he had scrawled on that page a hand. And they were all puzzled and couldn't figure out what in the world was that. And some of the kids said, "Oh, I know, that's the farmer's hand because he grows the turkey." The others said, "Oh, that's the hand of God because He provides all things." And no one got it right, and Douglas, being shy and quiet, never did explain what that was all about. She dismissed the kids out to recess, and she went up to little Douglas and said, "Douglas, what's this about?" And he looked up at her and he said, "It's your hand, teacher." And then she recalled how many times at recess she had gone out and taken Douglas's little scrawny, dirty little hand. It was his friend. But that simple touch of that hand made a big difference in that little boy's life. So, what's in your hand? Is it just a stick? That's great. That's exactly what God is looking for. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this day that you've given us. And Lord, each one of us here have something in our hand that you can use. Help us, Lord, to get beyond all of our excuses and our reasons why we can't and decide what we can do. Guide us and direct us. It's in Jesus' name we pray.